So let's begin with the book launch. I would like Mr. Ikhtisad to display the book to the people and speak a minute about it.
Thank you very much for that, Bikash, if I may. It is an absolute pleasure to be in such esteemed company, and I say that in earnestness, with earnestness. These are wonderful writers, and to have them on stage when my first collection of prose works is being launched is an honor and a humbling experience. Thank you very much. Just very briefly about the books. As you would have known from the name of this session, it is a short story collection of socio-political stories. I regularly lean on absurdism as a literary convention that I love, I adore, and I try to use. It is a humorous book of stories. It's satirical and dark humor, but humorous nonetheless. And I hope I have tried to present some of contemporary Bangladesh, rural and urban, through the stories to the world, as well as writing about some critical socio-political issues that affect people of foreigners in England, foreigners living in England and London. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Big round of applause for the launch. The topic we are discussing today is the short form, the linked form, and the long form. We have an author here who has successfully used the linked form in his book, Sandip. Can you tell us a little bit about the linked form?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Well, I'll tell you, my book is called Don't Let Him Know. And in fact, last year when I was in Dhaka, when the book was not out yet, that was the first time I ever talked about the book to an audience. So in a sense, it launched even before it actually was printed at the Dhaka festival. I have to say, the way I wrote this book, it's a novel in stories, which itself is not a very new form. Many people have done it. Some people would say that's the scared person's way to do a novel, like, oh, I can't really do a full novel, so I'll write stories and hopefully hang them out like clothes drying, and it'll add up to something bigger. But mine didn't quite start out that way. Don't Let Him Know is a book where I was writing short stories, and they had different characters. Some were written in first person, some were written in third person. And then at some point, I was in a writing group. I lived in California at that time. Somebody who knew me well read a couple of the stories and said, well, you're really writing about the same people. You've just given them different names in the day. And for a moment, I was really mortified because I thought I had a rich imagination and I had imagined all these different characters, but in fact, I was writing about the same three people over and over again. And once I got over that dismay, I realized that I had inadvertently possibly stumbled on vignettes about their lives of these characters. So the way the book in the end, and then I started working on it as a novel in stories. And the way the book ends up is that each chapter can be read as a standalone short story. So if you look at the contents and you say, oh, there's a chapter called The Games Boys Play, or a chapter called The Discipline of Haircuts, and that sounds interesting to me, you could read that without reading anything else in the book, and hopefully it would make complete sense to you. But if you read all the chapters in sequence, then the shadow of one chapter would fall on another chapter. You learn that something you thought was just a passing reference in one chapter actually alludes to a secret buried in the other chapter. The book is, in the end, about family secrets. And just to end quickly, so for example, in the very first chapter, my character, Romola, who is a widow living with her son, a young engineer. And the son has found an old letter, a piece of an old letter, one page, which he thinks is from among his mother's things, which he thinks is a love letter addressed to his mother from a former boyfriend of hers, not his father. But he's only found part of the letter. And so that in that chapter you read that. But in the second chapter, if you were to read it, it shows a young Romola who receives that letter and opens it by mistake. And there you read the full letter and realize that the love letter was not actually written to her at all. It was actually addressed to her husband, and she had stumbled upon it and hidden it among her things. So, which the son, of course, doesn't realize, and as a good mother, she's unable to tell the son this truth. So there's are secrets like that buried throughout the book, and if you read them in sequence, they add up to a story. But if you read it just by itself, each chapter, if you have a shorter attention span, it works as a short story. So that's how it's linked.
Yeah. Mahesh, your first book was a novel. Second was a collection of short stories. Due to the proliferation of gadgets, short stories now have a sea of readers. They are accessible everywhere. So they have a new ally in the form of the internet. Is there any chance that your third book will be linked stories?
Thank you. Sandip has just given us very clear and cogent reasons why, as he says, he stumbled into the linked story form, and that was the form that was perfect for his book. But there's another reason, I think, why linked stories are something that publishers gravitate towards, which is that they are actually very down on the short story. They don't like publishing short stories. The refrain is always they don't sell. And I'm sure they know what they're talking about because they have the numbers. But what you then have with the linked short story form is that, it can come in under stealth, by stealth as a sort of novel. So what they say is that it's very difficult to sell these short stories, so they'll try and disguise these linked short stories as a sort of novel. And it also means that they can perhaps enter them into prizes which are only eligible for novels. So there are lots of kind of commercial and practical... there are very few short story prizes compared to novel prizes, I think. So these are sort of commercial and practical reasons why, it's so difficult to get a collection of short stories published. So people tend to deviate into all these other things. And in fact, if you do write short stories, you're sort of almost treated as if you're into some kind of strange religious cult or something, There is this glazed look in people's eyes. If that is primarily what you write. If you're a novelist who also dabbles in short stories, I think it's different. For me, the thing is, I think writing short stories really makes you a better writer because you really focus on the minutiae of each sentence as you go along in a way that you don't for a novel. With a novel, there's this great big sweep, and you're just trying to get it done, at least with your first draft, and then you're revising and revising. But with the short story, as you work, you'll sort of progress much more slowly, but you're carving and you're chipping away all the time. And I really do think that makes you a better writer. And yes, I've been writing short stories now for the last 2-3 years. And I probably will go back to writing a novel, but it's hard because they are quite addictive, writing short stories. One reason is that the time span is quite short. You may spend 2 or 3 weeks on one, or maybe 2 or 3 months, but then you're done. Whereas with a novel, sometimes a novel can feel like this long, loveless marriage that you're stuck in, You're kind of trudging from day to day, and neither of you knows why. And there's no end in sight, and somehow you're just, it's just going and going and going. But then you've discovered the short story, which is like a sort of a series of very intense flings that they're incredible, and you end them and you have no wish to revisit them, but there are these incredibly fond memories, and you've just sort of moved on. So that can be quite addictive, but there is always pressure from publishers that we need another novel from you. So it's something you've got to decide for yourself as a writer, where does your heart really lie? Does it matter that you write short stories and that they might not sell? Does it matter to you, and how much does it matter to you?
Ranbir, short stories, the long form, and linked stories. Can you tell us a little bit about how these three forms are received in the West?
I can try.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that sort of linked stories, as you were saying, are much more. Sort of publishers look on them sort of much more with much more sort of grace and the possibility that they can sort of take the short story tag off the cover and try and persuade buyers that it's actually a novel that they're getting. And so they think they can sell more of them. And I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think it's a pity, because I think sort of linked stories are sort of a fantastic form in and of themselves and sort of an interesting form. Yeah, it's odd because there's so many short story writers now in the West. People are writing many short stories, and actually many fine stories, and there's sort of many venues to publish them. I do wonder how much they're getting read though. Which is unfortunate, but I think there's some really fantastic work going on in short stories. It's a place where ultimately you can experiment and play and do really interesting things, which if you tried that in a novel, first of all, it would take you several years to decide whether it worked or not. And also, it often wouldn't, the kind of play you can sort of achieve in a story would not succeed at the length of 200 or 300 pages. I wrote a story that was published recently. I wrote it quite a long time ago. I never thought anyone would publish it. But it's written in the voice of 15th or 16th century seamen finding a sort of a lost isle. And it's written with all the grammatical and textual errors that you would find in a lot to see, and those are some of the sort of the great things that you can both do in a story and find in a story.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, Ikhtisad, this is a short story collection. Did you, at any moment, feel like maybe I should write linked stories because it caters to both the readership that looks for standalone stories and the readership that looks for a novel?
The short answer is no. But I will pick up on some of the things that have already come out of this engaging discussion. One of the reasons I wrote the short story was I don't set out with an idea of how the work will present itself. In my limited time as a writer, and I do stress it is limited, and these people know far more than I do, so don't believe a word of what I'm about to say. But in my limited time, the way my process works is I get an idea and I let it fester. It doesn't germinate, it festers until it needs to be cut out. And I figure out what the best way of expressing it would be. And I've been attempting to write a fairly complex novel that wasn't quite working, and I needed to figure out. I needed to figure out what I wanted to say in this novel and what I, as a writer, was going to present myself as. And that really was one of the reasons why I wrote the short story. The other one is I absolutely take the point that Mahesh, Sandip, and Ranbir have touched on, where Western publishers are they are not keen on short stories, And yes, they do know more about the market than writers do. But I would also stress that they are trying to dictate the reading trends with saying we're going to stifle the short story form. I believe the short story is going to make a return. We have readers have shorter attention spans because of the proliferation of the internet and all that comes with it, all the wonderful things that come with it. In addition to that, while there isn't much money in writing short stories. There is no money by way of, say, getting a big signing contract with a publisher. And the short story prizes compared to novels are fewer and they pay less. But if you want to get published, if you want your name out there in various journals, the short story form is one that allows you to do that. You can send your work in and journals will be more receptive, obviously, within their guidelines. So these are some of the reasons that went into writing the book that I wrote. For me as well, coming from Bangladesh, we read more short stories, I've noticed, than I would argue than people in England do. It comes from the literary traditions of our country. In Bangladesh, you're not really taken seriously as a writer until you have written poetry that people are convinced with. So the longer form would then be stretching a poem enough so that it becomes a story, which would be a short story. And people read more of that, and historically our publishing establishment has been newspapers which put out literary supplements, which only used to, and now they've expanded, but used to only publish poems and short stories. So whatever we have preserved, and we have been blissfully ignorant when it comes to preserving our literary heritage, especially post-independence, and claiming it pre-independence. But whatever we have preserved have happened because of what was printed in these various newspapers, printing poetry and short stories, and therefore audiences are more receptive of it. And finally, lastly, I would say, reason behind it was there were important things. I don't think Bangladesh gets its dues in the world. We are the 8th most populated country. We make significant contributions to the world, and we have done an awful job presenting ourselves to the world in the right light. And I wanted to, in my own way, try to introduce Bangladesh through various stories, not just one. And I felt short stories would allow me to dedicate myself to individual issues and individual characters a lot better than a novel would.
Okay. He mentioned about the short attention span, the internet, the gadgets, the linked form as against the novel. Do you think all these factors favor the short form? I mean, are things moving in that direction? I mean, because it fits the screen. I mean, in Nepal, we have many digital newspapers that devote their weekend editions to short stories, and a lot of people read that. Although I mean, this doesn't reflect in the print market. I mean, digitally, they have access to a very big readership. So, are things moving in that direction? What are your observations?
If I could just take that quickly. One thing I'd say is that, short story writers are a little bit like poets in the sense that their work isn't considered commercially viable. But poets don't do this thing that short story writers seem to, which is constantly discuss the nature of their form. Presumably they just go ahead and write whatever poetry they want to write. Whereas it's become this thing within, short story communities or people who write short stories, is the form making a renaissance? Is it coming back? And so we end up talking about that quite a lot rather than actual short stories, the stories we love, the people who write short stories that we love, whether it's Catherine Mansfield or William Trevor or whoever it may be. But in terms of the technology, this is, again, another story that we like to tell ourselves a lot, and I'm all for believing it, that, the rise of handheld devices and, reading on iPads and iPhones and this sort of thing will help, with the resurrection of the short story again. But actually, I think it does a little bit of a disservice to how short stories are read, because they are very intense experiences. I think when you read a novel, I mean, we've all read novels which we've loved, but, you know, there are pages where you kind of drift off and you sort of skim quite quickly, and, you know, you thought, I did quite like that novel, but I could have done with a bit less of the sunsets on page 84 to 88, you know, sort of that sort of thing. And that's the nature of the novel. That's kind of how we all read it. But with a short story, every sentence counts, every word counts. So there is an intensity about the reading experience as well. And I'm not sure that you get it in the same way if you're reading it on a phone, on a bus. I mean, you can read it on whatever device you want. That's fine. But I'm talking about the immersive quality of the reading experience, because short stories are about that moment, a transformation in a moment. And the idea that if you have a short attention span, that this is the form for you, I don't think that quite fits. I think it's a profound engagement, and it needs to be taken very seriously. It's not something that can be relegated to a sort of reading on the hop.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, because I think there is a tendency, and Mahesh is right, in that unlike, even if poetry and short stories are both regarded as commercially not so viable, there is a tendency, which is not there in poems, with short stories, where you think of short stories as waiting to grow up and become a novel. So people think, acha, you've written the short story. And there was some issue even with my book, with the linked stories. There was a brief moment of discussion as to, okay, can you link them properly enough so that it now becomes a novel and, you know, the gaps don't show. And I realized that, in a sense, I couldn't, because it would destroy the integrity of the book. It was designed as vignettes of these lives, you know, like it's like as a writer, I'm swooping into the lives of these three people at different times and seeing what they're up to, once as a little boy, or once as a teenager, or as an older person. And if I was trying to novelize it, you know, I would have to draw all kinds of connecting lines that I wanted the reader to imagine what had happened to the characters in between these chapters. So in that sense, you know, and you can't, in the end, while writing, I mean, there is the market and all of that, but in the end, you can't, while writing, worry about whether the form is making a comeback or a renaissance. You write it because you like it, or you love it, or that feels right for the story that you're about to tell. If you were consistently worrying about the form that's commercially viable, you might write romance fiction or young adult or many other things that are out there that are selling way more copies than my book ever will. And it is true that even if a Jhumpa Lahiri wins a National Book Award for a collection of short stories, I heard it back then that, acha, when she won the National Book Award for the interpreter of Pulitzer. She won the Pulitzer, right? When she won the Pulitzer for interpreter of melodies, that, oh my goodness, the short story is back. You know, and that was how many years ago, and we're still talking about the short story might be coming back. Oh, Alice Munro wins, so short story must be back now. And, you know, it's still perennially coming back, but I don't see it, you know, as the publishers rushing to say, okay, the Nobel has been won, the Pulitzer has been won, next year, all short stories all the time.
If I may just briefly interject, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, I think that there's far too much emphasis put on trying to categorize the output of writers, rather than simply saying, these are writers, they write. I also think that one of the problems that we have, in addition to trying to categorize writers and trying to pigeonhole what their output entails, what we are trying to do, and one of the reasons why we keep talking about the short story coming back, is simply not respecting individual forms of writing, individual media. A novel in short stories, for instance, is a distinct piece of literature to a short story collection or to a novel. And I don't think there is enough respect paid to these the different skills required to write these different things. I was wondering if I just wanted to get your
I'll say
thoughts.
Something about that. It is true. I mean, once I wrote the book, once I figured out that the form of the book was going to be chapters which would read like standalone stories, but it would be linked, I thought I had solved my puzzle. But then I realized I'd landed myself into a whole nother problem, which is where, I mean, it's very funny when you compare the novel to a long loveless marriage, possibly, and short stories to your brief flings. The point with the brief flings is, for your next fling, you don't have to remember the last fling, It's like, it's over, it's gone. It's like ashes in tinder or whatever. But when it's a linked story, then your flings come back to haunt you, because you have to remember what she was doing in the first chapter. And I had the problem where a character's, when she's young, at one point is just with the mother, the father is dead, and then in a later form, the dead father is suddenly talking to the character, and then I realized, oh, the father is dead. He cannot be weighing in on her marriage prospects right now. So then I have to bring in an uncle or somebody to do that. But that's the problem. Yeah, I mean, houses changing color, and you have to remember all kinds of detail, which really annoying readers will then find out and point to you and tell you, like, oh, you said the house was green in the third chapter, but in the seventh chapter, the house has turned into cream. And then you realize, like, oh my goodness, this is what they say when they say your past you never live down your past.
Well, that is when you can go to a reader. Well, you were supposed to imagine someone came in and painted it again.
I think you have to be very clear about your intention as well, because, I mean, the last thing you would want, as you say, is for your past flings to come back and haunt you, So I think, I was very inspired by this Vietnamese Australian writer called Nam Le, who has this wonderful collection of short stories called The Boat. And what he does extremely audaciously in his collection is he just throws himself into disparate worlds. So he has a story there that's set in Colombia, in Cartagena, which is told from the point of view of a slum kid. And then he has a story set in Japan around the time of the bombings at the end of World War II. So the bomb is just about to land on, I forget, it's either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but it's told from the point of view of a young girl in one of those cities. And then he moves across, there's a tale of Vietnamese boat people, and then he's a judge in New York City. And it's really audacious because each story is completely different from the other. It's the antithesis of the linked story in that sense. And it's really a statement of intent that, I am going to write stories that have no connection to each other. I'm almost going to make it really hard for the marketing people to say, how do we sum this up? Because that is very often the problem. They don't know, how do we sum this up? How do we give it a lovely little 2-sentence blurb that can be put out in press releases? And it was that statement of intent that came to life in his stories. It sort of got me thinking, when you're writing about India, it's also possible to encapsulate so many different worlds within one collection. And so my only rule for myself when I wrote the collection was make each story as different as possible. Let them be united in their diversity. So each story is set in a different state in India. So we go from Delhi to the Nilgiri Hills in the south, to Calcutta, to Bombay, to Chhattisgarh, a detention camp there. So that's the wonderful thing about writing in a place which is so diverse. All these worlds are open to you, and the short story form then is perfect for that. Particularly if you're just trying to encapsulate a moment. One of the stories is about an elderly man who falls in love with his daughter-in-law. And I think this happens a lot, actually, in South Asia. It must do, because the way I came to the story was I heard an anecdote about a man who was peeking at his daughter-in-law through the bathroom window as she was showering. And of course, this is horrible, and it's kind of completely violative. But there is also a deep pathos in this as well, and an odd kind of sick humor. It contains all of these things, that moment. And so you can't write a novel about it necessarily, you know, but a short story is perfect for that moment. The moment where a daughter-in-law finds out that her father-in-law is in love with her, you know, that form is just perfect to capture that moment. So yeah, it's very often it's about intentions and what you're actually trying to portray for that moment.
Yeah, I just want to sort of reiterate what you said about this sense of empathy that a short story can sort of plunge you into this entirely other being, and sort of you can live through that, which I think sort of is one of the great things that writing itself does, is that it gives you this sort of this deep sense of sympathy for another person, and it puts you in their skin, or it can put you in their skin, quite literally. There's, you know, and talking about moments, there's a story by Graham Greene, which is about this loveless English couple in the 1930s, where I forget the times, they watch a porn movie together, and I think she discovers that it's her husband as the man in the porn movie as they're sitting there watching this. And that's what the entire story is about, this one moment of them, sort of like her watching her husband in a porn movie while they've had this loveless, horrible marriage all these years. But I want to go back to something you said earlier. You said it takes you 2 or 3 weeks, or can take you 2 or 3 weeks to write a story. It takes me years to write a story. And I was wondering what others felt about that, because I can write like the beginning of a story and it works wonderfully, then I have no idea where to take it, and it can sit there for year after year after year. I go back to it, and it never. And then finally, at some point, something clicks, and that's how it all ends. And yeah.
Yeah, that was a completely misleading statement. I'm sorry. I've only ever written one story in about 3 weeks, and very worryingly, it was in the voice of a very spoilt and unpleasant teenage brat. But this is a voice that came to me very, very easily. And I don't know what it says about my psyche. I'm sort of quite cut up about it. But it is a story that I managed to write very, very quickly. But you're right. I mean, stories can take years to kind of reflect on them and to refine them and to kind of produce something that you're vaguely happy with. And I have also written a story that took about 3.5 years to write. So, yeah.
I actually, my training is not in writing or literature or anything. I am a software engineer by training who wandered into journalism and writing. And I think it is a residue of my software background that I find it actually really hard to write, whether it's a short story or a chapter or even an article, unless I can think of a beginning line and unless I can think of an ending line. And then it's like an exercise, a plodding exercise in join the dots from that beginning line to the ending line. And it might, you know, at the end of the process, that ending line might move somewhere and become the middle of the story. But until I can think of that start and end point, almost like a computer program, as it were, where so it doesn't compile in my head, and I just stare at the blank screen for a long time. And in fact, in my book as well, there's a scene in it about a mother and a child standing on a terrace, which was the starting scene for me for the book. And as it turned out, it ended up in the middle end of chapter 3. But until that scene was there, the rest of the book could not flow. It's like, you know, it needed that starting point to radiate out from.
I will say something that may sound quite verbose or glamorous about the writing process for me. Even if I am fortunate enough to be able to write something in a day, I don't think of it as having been written in a day. What we, as readers and audience members, what the outside world often mistakes as being writing is the act of putting pen to paper. There is a lot more that goes into it. We have to do the thinking, the research, the reading that goes into that moment when we have decided to express a thought in a particular way, and knowing what else is out there. I take and without meaning to take this in a serious, take the conversation in a serious direction, I take writing very seriously because I come from a country and a part of the world where people are being killed for what they're writing. And the written word for me is sacrosanct. And as a result of that, every single thing that I put out needs to be respectful enough of being deserving of being printed. And I think of it as every day I have spent alive has led up to a moment where I've written something. Every single day of that is part of that process and part of that story. So just a roundabout way of saying I don't really know what I'm talking about, I suppose.
Let's move on to a little different question. How political is fiction in all forms? Your opinion. You're a journalist. I'm a journalist. You're a human rights lawyer. Maybe our writing has a heavy dose of our political biases. Probably, I'm just suggesting. May not be the case. But for you guys, how do you see it?
I felt, I think I grew up in a very sort of political environment when I was younger, and I was quite active politically, both in sort of the anti-apartheid movement and the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK, and the Green Party and different parties. But I feel sort of in terms of, I've come to feel much more in terms of fiction that I really want to separate my politics from my fiction, and that one should, at least I feel that sort of one should disengage that, because I guess I find, especially in this sort of these deeply politicized times we live in, where so much of our lives are buried in politics, and maybe not directed by politics, but where politics sort of is intruding, that fiction too often, at least for me, sort of becomes enmeshed somewhat in that, and it's nice to be able to step back from that sometimes. There's a lot of great political fiction which I deeply admire, and there's certainly it's been a great force the 20th century for change, but I feel more and more I'm hesitant about engaging in politics. And also, I think, sort of, it's interesting, as we were talking about sort of empathy. I think it's interesting to engage when one is writing, to try and engage empathetically with people we violently disagree with, and try and write from their perspective, as if we were them. I think it can be uncomfortable sometimes for readers because they don't quite know where you stand. But it can be that can be, I think, in some ways a quite transformative and interesting experience, both for the writer and for the reader. But
your thoughts?
I think it sort of depends on what you mean by politics. I take a very broad view of the term politics. So for me, it's very difficult to disengage my politics with anything I write, because I think the mere act of writing is a political act. Particularly in a place like Bangladesh, say, as we've heard, you can die because of what you've written. But I think anywhere, the mere act of writing, I think, is a political act. And for anyone who disagrees and says, my writing is not at all politics, and it's not at all political, I try and avoid that as much as possible. That in itself is a political position. And I think, you may think you're writing about, very commercial things, things that have nothing to do with the great political issues of the day. But almost all writing reveals something about gender or class or, something of your worldview, which is somehow steeped in politics. So I think for me, I find it very hard to divorce those two. But coming back to what was said here, I think it is also important to look at things from another point of view. So for me, fiction is always about asking the questions, not necessarily providing the answers. And the questions can be asked from the political viewpoint that you espouse, but also from another viewpoint. What is most interesting to me in fiction is the gray area, not the people who violently agree with you or the people who violently disagree with you, but those people who are in the middle, who kind of waver. I think that makes for the best fiction, because the boundaries are blurred and the reader never quite knows, where they are, and there are spaces for them to insert themselves into your narrative, and I think that's really important in fiction.
Being a journalist, maybe you have a different answer.
Well, in the end, I guess, you are a writer. Even as a journalist, the kind of journalism I did was about telling stories. So in the sense, one story was fictional, one was non-fictional, sort of, and now everything is creative fiction anyway. So all those boundaries are getting increasingly blurred. But no, I agree entirely with Mahesh in the sense that, we think that something is political if it is linked very directly to a political event that is happening currently around. But that is, it's based in that particular time. In the book I wrote, there are no national events that are part of the narrative of the book, but it is political. Obviously, it is political in the way because it is tracing through the characters' attitudes about sexuality, attitudes about the position of women in the household. There is a great-grandmother's character in the book who is dealing with the fact that once she's a widow, she is not allowed to eat meat or fish, but she cannot give up the memory of the fish head, and she still wants to crunch the fish head. And then 30 years later, when her granddaughter-in-law herself is widowed, has to confront with similar issues, but not exactly the same again. So all of those, you're writing it about moments in their lives when this woman who has become vegetarian is looking at an ad for a burger on a TV and feels this insatiable craving for it. So it's about that character, but it's also about a larger issue that is happening. So, and if you were to take all those issues out of the book would fall flat in a way, because it's that hidden socio-political background that actually adds the context and the pathos and the poignancy, because it's only when you know that the relationship between the father-in-law and a daughter-in-law is so forbidden that the pathos and the poignancy of this old man peeking in on this woman showering really springs at you. Otherwise, it's just, if you just looked at it as a picture, it would just be a peeping Tom looking at someone, which would be entirely different.
A quick comment from you, and then we'll take questions.
Yes, I will primarily echo what Sandip and Mahesh have said. Firstly, the fact that what we're writing, they have to have those layers, those intricacies, and every single thing that we mention, we're making a statement which effectively would be political or socio-political. They are part of the genetic makeup of the story, and I absolutely echo what Mahesh has said as well, that writing itself is a political act. For me personally, writing is an act of rebellion, and what I write engages with the politics, but it isn't simply going, if it is going to be fiction, it has to have those layers, it has to engage with whoever's going to read it. And I will just, minor correction, I used to be a human rights lawyer, and I gave up on law. I was a middling lawyer at best. I was terrible. But I gave up on my legal profession and attempted to write or pursued a writing career because I wanted to be honest. And I think writing is the only honest profession left.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I'd just like to sort of make one comment. I agree with much of what you're saying, but again, here when we're talking about politics and politics within the story, and say, sort of the example of the father-in-law and that relationship and how charged that relationship is, to read it politically, is a particular reading, of the story within a particular context, and I get that reading, but I resist. I think I resist the idea of classifying that relationship in political terms. I think it's more interesting if we sort of disengage how we talk about particular aspects of relationships, gender, history, sexuality, by classifying them as political. For me, I find myself increasingly, I feel that reduces the power and the pathos and what's really sort of alive and engaged in those moments. And I think maybe I just, certainly in America, I find so much that finds so much of that red, so-called politically, and it reduces, it takes agency away from the characters within the story, and reduces them sometimes to props within sort of larger sort of battles, and I find that difficult to take sometimes. Yeah.
So let's take questions. I hope there are some questions. Anyone? Excuse me? Can you send her a mic?
I certainly belong to that strange religious cult which reads fiction only in short stories, and I don't know what that says about me, a lesser literary person, perhaps less moral because it's now intense flings rather than a long marriage. But I'm wondering if you can talk about the practical aspects which some of you have touched on publishers and marketing. You know, this thing of how short stories can't be summed up into a very simple sentence. Perhaps that's why I like reading them, because there's a multitude of voices. But I'm wondering, how do you break through that? Is there a way, when so much of publishing is driven by the marketing aspect of it, how does one break through it?
Yeah, we all knew the answer. If we all knew the answer, then there would be a lot more short story collections coming out, and we don't have a publisher. No, but it is a challenge. And now I'll flip roles and say, as a journalist, I used to host a radio show. And it is true, if when you have writers and people send you the press release, if it's a short story collection of short stories, you will think twice about bringing that person on your show, because you will be trying to figure out how, for an audience that is listening to your show, which has not read the book, how will you frame the conversation so it can be intelligible to the, nonfiction is easy. You talk about the theme. Fiction and a novel is still okay, but short stories, if they are very disparate, how do you do enough, unless the writer themselves is already somebody well-known or fascinating, how do you talk about the book in a way that reaches the audience and gives them enough information to be both informed and enticed enough by the book? And I think when you brought up the boat, I remember when the boat was published in the US, it was really much anticipated. And I think it struggled because of what was actually its greatest strength, that it spoke in so many voices. But we are in a culture where we want to reduce everything to one identifiable voice. So someone like Nam Le, everyone would be like, okay, so he's the Vietnamese American writer, so he must be able to talk about the Vietnamese community in the US or what's going on in Vietnam. But in fact, he's written a book that is set in Colombia and Japan, and people don't know what to make of such a multi-dimensional person, because it's much more comfortable to be able to put somebody in a little box and stick a label, whether it's African American, immigrant, or gay, lesbian, or whatever, which we tend to mostly do with writers of color, because other people can write about, they're just regarded as American writers, whereas these ones will be Asian American or Latin American writers.
Yeah, I think it is very difficult because marketing, publicity teams, they sort of tie themselves in knots over this, which is why they really favor things like the linked short story, things that can, you know, come in under the guise of a novel. And I think they do look for themes. So if you can say thematically or geographically link your stories, that is something that a marketing person would be really, really grateful for. So if you can say a collection of short stories that are all set in, you know, on a particular Greek island, you know, reflecting a community, you know, that's another way. It sort of brings in this kind of novelistic, overarching umbrella under which they can all hide, you know. But I think people can be creative about this. I mean, you mentioned about going onto a radio show and talking about it, but you don't have to talk about the whole collection. You can pick 2 or 3 stories to talk about. If you're talking about poetry collection, again, you might just want to reflect on 2 or 3 of the poems. You know, it's not absolutely necessary for you to try and sum up the whole work. So there are many creative ways of doing this, but I think what it does is it does sort of force writers who have collections to be a bit gimmicky about it. I mean, I remember someone telling me that they've written a short story collection and they wanted to call it Yellow Car, and I said, why? And he said, because there is a yellow car featured in each story. And I thought, okay, you know, that's right. But, you know, these really kind of contorted, contrived ways of trying to sell this, you know, I mean, I just would not gravitate towards a collection of stories that had a yellow car in each story. It just doesn't do anything for me. Yeah, it's just not my fetish, you know. But I think, you know, people do get into all these sorts of binds, and then it becomes self-perpetuating because they go for short story collections that are perhaps have a unified theme. So, for example, they're all set in a certain war zone, or they're all about war or something. And then as a reader, you kind of read the short story collection and think, well, they're a little bit samey, you know. A lot of these short stories are quite similar, and they kind of focus on similar themes. And I'm not really sure what to do with this. And it all just gets, and then they don't sell, and then it becomes all sort of self-reinforcing. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that perhaps publishers should be bolder in terms of accepting the difference and diversity within a short story collection.
I knew somebody who said they wanted to put a recipe with every single short story. That would be the thing.
If I could just add a quick word from a Bangladeshi perspective, Bangladeshi publishers have a hunger for short stories, and I specifically targeted my collection towards Bangladeshi publishers before looking at any other market because I knew it would be easier to get published. So it's worth bearing in mind, especially for Bangladeshi writers.
That's not the case in Nepal, just for your information.
Well, it's good to know. Now you know about Nepal too.
Yeah. Any more question? Okay, sure. Last.
Some short stories are really short, and some short stories are quite big, as we have read some big stories by Tagore. These are like novelettes. So what I want to know is, do you suggest any ideal size of short story, just 1-page story or 100-page story? Just I want to know your ideas or your suggestion.
See, in terms of this, size does not matter. This is one thing where size doesn't matter. You know, in the end, it is how long you need to tell the story. And and I think the main thing what I've found for short stories that I've left is, there's a phrase in Bangla which I'll translate for people who are not, shesh hoiyao na hoilo shesh. You know, so it finishes and yet is left unfinished. So for me, the ones that have worked most effectively is the one that have left a trace of that short story in your mind, almost like a lingering question, which leaves you wondering and doesn't spend all the time to tie up all the possible loose ends, but you leave that book, that story aside, and you're still wondering, well, what happened to that person?
Yeah, I'd very much agree that size doesn't matter. at least as from the writer's perspective. From magazines and literary magazines, unfortunately, size very often does matter, and many magazines won't publish stories longer than, say, 20 pages or so. A few do. And last year I wrote a long story about 40-some pages, oddly about a bright green, from the perspective of a bright green dodecahedron traveling through the 20th century, which I'm still wondering who is going to publish. But for me, for me the joy of the story is that, you don't know where it's going to end, and I think it's important to give it all the space it needs. Sometimes it's only 5 pages, and sometimes that is like 60, 70 pages. And hopefully some publishers like that, some don't.
Yeah, that brings us to the conclusion of the session. Thank you so much for your patience, for your participation, for your questions. Our books are available at the stalls. I don't know about theirs. My book, my novel, is the only book from Nepal, I guess. It's available at the Bookworm stall. It's a novel called Unlikely Storytellers. Please read it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wonderful.